Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works, like we take the time to really unpack a complex topic. So today, well, actually, I guess every time we do this, we pick a source and then we really dive in to get you the information you need.
That's right.
Today, we're going to be talking about Argentina,
Yes.
newly elected president Javier Milei,
Right.
and specifically his economic plan.
Which is a bold one.
Yeah, so this is a pretty big deal because it looks like it could be a real-world test of anarcho-capitalist principles, on a national scale.
Absolutely. High stakes.
Yeah, high stakes indeed, and the source that we're using today is it's a blog post by Costa1611 titled El Loco Milei, Argentina's Libertarian Revolution.
Catchy title.
Yeah, very catchy. So I guess the overarching question we're going to be trying to answer is will Milei's gamble pay off?
Right.
Or will Argentina become a cautionary tale?
A lot of people are asking that.
A lot of people are asking that, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
So to kind of kick things off here, I think it's important to talk about Milei himself.
Of course.
I mean, the guy has a pretty explosive personality.
He does.
Like, he's been nicknamed El Loco, which means the madman.
That's right.
And he's got kind of this rock star-like appeal.
It's true. He's very charismatic, and his background as an economist definitely plays a role. He draws a lot of inspiration from the Austrian School of Economics.
Right, and I guess the Austrian school, for people who aren't familiar, that's...
Well, you've got thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises.
Okay.
They're really central to the school of thought, and they were all about minimal government intervention. They believed that free markets are just the best way to allocate resources.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they were also deeply skeptical of central banking and any kind of state control over the economy.
So it sounds like Milei's platform isn't just like a knee-jerk reaction to what's going on in Argentina.
No.
It sounds like it's really rooted in something much deeper.
It's deeply ideological, yeah. And I think his message really resonated with Argentinians. I mean, they've been dealing with economic instability and corruption for years.
Right. So how does this Austrian school perspective actually translate into policy, though?
Well, Milei's plan is interesting because it goes beyond traditional libertarianism. He's advocating for almost completely eliminating the state and replacing it with a system where private contracts and market forces kind of rule everything.
So that sounds a lot like anarcho-capitalism.
Exactly. It's a really radical approach. And his vision includes some pretty key elements: dollarization, privatization, and massive tax cuts.
And each one of those ideas comes with its own set of potential benefits and risks, right?
Absolutely. And the way they all interact could really reshape Argentina's economic and social landscape. It's a bold experiment.
Let's break down each of these elements, starting with dollarization.
Okay.
So the idea is to replace the Argentine peso with the US dollar, right?
That's right.
And the argument is that this could help curb Argentina's chronic hyperinflation. But how would that actually work?
Well, the thinking is that dollarization would take away the government's ability to manipulate the money supply, which is something that a lot of people point to as a driver of inflation.
Oh, okay.
So by pegging the Argentine economy to a stable currency like the US dollar, Milei's trying to restore confidence in the monetary system.
So essentially trying to import stability.
Exactly, yeah.
But by surrendering control of monetary policy to the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Right. There are definitely trade-offs.
What kind of downsides are we talking about?
Well, while dollarization might offer a quick fix for hyperinflation, Argentina would be giving up its monetary sovereignty.
Okay.
They wouldn't be able to adjust interest rates or manage their currency in response to any kind of economic shocks.
So they'd be vulnerable to fluctuations in the U.S. economy.
Exactly, and policies of the Federal Reserve, which are totally outside of Argentina's control. This lack of control could really make things worse if there are external economic shocks.
Yeah, so it sounds like a bit of a gamble.
It is a big one.
Okay, so let's move on to Milei's plan for privatization.
Right, yeah.
He wants to sell off state-owned companies and assets.
He does.
Potentially even things like roads, schools, and the energy grid.
That's right. Some pretty essential stuff.
Yeah, so what's the thinking behind that?
Well, the main argument is that private companies are just more efficient than state-run enterprises because they're driven by profit.
Okay.
So the belief is that competition in a free market will lead to lower prices, better service quality, and more innovation.
And this is all based on the idea that the invisible hand of the market will just sort of regulate itself and lead to the best possible outcomes.
Right.
But I mean, is that realistic? Especially when we're talking about things like education and energy.
Well, that's where the criticisms of widespread privatization come in. Some people argue that if you leave essential services entirely to the market, they could become inaccessible to people who can't afford them.
Right.
So you could end up with increased inequality and a two-tiered system. And there are also concerns about monopolies forming in those sectors.
Which could lead to price gouging and lower quality service.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
So it sounds like the potential benefits, like increased efficiency and innovation, need to be weighed against the risks of things like reduced access, price manipulation, and the possibility that essential services will be driven by profit rather than the public good.
Absolutely. It's a balancing act, for sure.
All right. Now let's talk about the last part of Milei's plan. The drastic tax cuts.
Okay.
Now, I know reducing taxes might sound pretty good to a lot of people, especially businesses and high earners.
Sure.
But what are the potential consequences of such a move, both for the economy and for society as a whole?
Well, from the Austrian school perspective, the idea is that cutting taxes will stimulate economic growth
Okay.
because it leaves more money in the hands of individuals and businesses.
Makes sense.
And they believe this will lead to more investment, job creation, and ultimately a more prosperous society.
But there's always that question of whether those benefits will actually trickle down to everyone.
Right, that's a major point of contention. Critics of these large-scale tax cuts argue that they often benefit wealthier individuals and corporations disproportionately,
Yeah.
and that can lead to a wider gap between the rich and the poor.
It does seem like this plan presents a fascinating case study in the practical application of anarcho-capitalist principles.
It does.
But it's still too early to say for sure whether these policies will lead to a better Argentina or if they'll just amplify the existing challenges.
We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. But one thing that is really interesting is that Milei's victory isn't an isolated event.
That's true.
I mean, it's part of a broader global trend where more and more people are becoming interested in libertarian ideas.
Yeah, we're seeing it in different forms all over the world. Think about figures like Ron Paul in the U.S.,
Right.
the rise of the alt-right libertarian movement, even Silicon Valley's fascination with decentralized governance and things like seasteading.
Interesting.
It all points to a growing disillusionment with traditional political systems.
Right. People are searching for alternatives.
Exactly. And what makes Milei's Argentina so unique is that it's not just theory anymore. It's a full-fledged attempt to put these anarcho-capitalist ideas into practice on a national level.
Which makes it even more crucial to understand the nuances of his economic plan and what the potential outcomes might be.
Absolutely. It's not just about Argentina anymore. This could have implications for how we think about the role of the state, the power of free markets, and the pursuit of a just and prosperous society globally. I think it's important to remember Argentina's economic history, too.
Yeah.
You know, they've had a lot of struggles,
Yeah.
numerous economic crises over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, hyperinflation,
Right.
debt defaults, currency devaluation.
Exactly. So this instability makes it understandable why people are so desperate for change.
Right.
But it also makes Milei's approach that much riskier.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest concerns is about his privatization plans. Critics worry that if you hand over essential services like education and healthcare to the private sector,
Yeah.
it could be really bad for the poor and vulnerable people in society.
Yeah, because the theory behind privatization,
Uh-huh.
it assumes that everyone has an equal chance to participate in the market.
Right.
And that's just not the reality in a place with so much income inequality.
Yeah.
Like, if access to essential services depends only on your ability to pay,
Right.
the people who are already struggling are just going to fall further behind.
So it sounds like for privatization to really work,
Yeah.
it's not just about the private sector being efficient.
No.
The government also has to step up and make sure that everyone has equal access
Absolutely.
and prevent companies from taking advantage of people.
Mm.
So how do you actually do that? What are the safeguards?
Well, one way is to have really strong regulations in place,
Okay.
you know, to make sure pricing is fair and prevent monopolies.
Mm-hmm.
And you could even mandate a certain level of service that has to be provided to communities that are underserved.
Okay, so kind of like a baseline level of service that everyone has access to, no matter what.
And another option is to keep the state involved to some degree.
Okay.
Maybe a hybrid model where the government sets standards,
Right.
provides some subsidies,
Mm-hmm.
but still allows private companies to compete within that regulated market.
Okay, so it's not all or nothing.
Right. It's about finding the right balance.
So this hybrid approach sounds like it could be a good way to get the efficiency of the private sector while still maintaining some public oversight,
Right.
and making sure everyone has access.
Exactly.
But, Argentina hasn't always had the best track record when it comes to government capacity and commitment.
That's true, and that's a real concern.
Yeah.
Because if the government isn't able to effectively regulate and enforce the rules,
Right.
privatization could just end up shifting control from a potentially inefficient public sector to a potentially exploitative private sector.
And the people who suffer the most are the ones who can least afford it.
Exactly. It's a real risk.
So I want to talk about the proposed tax cuts now.
Okay.
Proponents say they'll stimulate economic growth, but critics worry about inequality.
Right. Well, the argument against these big tax cuts,
Yeah.
especially the ones that benefit the wealthy the most,
Yeah.
is that they just make existing wealth disparities even worse.
Okay.
Because when a smaller percentage of the population holds a larger share of the national income, it can lead to a decline in aggregate demand.
Because fewer people have money to spend.
Exactly. And that can stifle economic growth.
Right.
And it creates the situation where the wealthy are increasingly isolated.
From the struggles of everyday people.
Exactly. And that can lead to social unrest and instability.
So these tax cuts, they might give a short-term boost to the economy.
Yeah.
But in the long run, it all comes down to how those benefits are distributed.
Right.
And whether they actually make society more equitable.
Absolutely. It can't just be about growth.
Yeah. It has to be about inclusive growth.
So what can be done alongside these tax cuts to promote a more inclusive economic model?
Well, one approach is to have a progressive tax system
Okay.
where higher earners pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes.
So that the burden is shared more fairly?
Exactly. And then that revenue can be used to fund social programs.
Invest in things like education and infrastructure.
Right.
And provide a safety net for the most vulnerable.
Exactly.
So it sounds like we need to think about economic policy, not just in terms of growth, but also in terms of equity and social well-being.
Absolutely, because economic growth has to be inclusive.
And the benefits have to be shared broadly if it's going to be sustainable.
Exactly.
And beneficial to everyone in the long run.
It's about creating an economic environment where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and contribute to their full potential.
Which brings us back to Miley's experiment.
Right?
Can a nation really thrive under a model that prioritizes individual liberty and free markets above everything else? Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anarcho-capitalists believe that the free market can provide all the essential services.
Even things like law enforcement and national defense.
Right, but critics point out that there are often market failures.
Especially in areas where the profit motive might not align with the public good.
Exactly. And so there's this real concern about the potential for conflict between private interests and what's best for society as a whole.
Like, how do you make sure that private security forces are actually acting ethically? Or that private courts are dispensing justice fairly?
Right, and that they're not being influenced by the wealth or power of the people involved.
Yeah, are there ways to address those concerns?
Well, anarcho-capitalists propose things like reputation systems and competing providers.
Okay.
And contractual agreements with clear standards and consequences.
So kind of like building in checks and balances, even without a traditional government structure.
Exactly, but whether those mechanisms can actually prevent abuses of power and ensure a just and equitable society, that remains to be seen.
It's all very theoretical at this point.
Right. There's not a lot of real-world evidence to go on.
And then there's the issue of public goods.
Things like infrastructure and environmental protection.
Which are often hard for private markets to provide efficiently.
Because of things like free riding and the difficulty of excluding people who don't pay from benefiting.
Right. So how would an anarcho-capitalist system handle that?
Well, they suggest things like voluntary contributions,
Okay.
user fees, private agreements to fund and maintain those public goods.
But again, it's not clear whether that would actually work on a large scale.
It's untested.
So as we've seen, Miley's experiment has a lot of potential, both good and bad.
It does.
The idea of limited government and individual freedom is appealing.
Sure.
But you can't ignore the complexities of governing a country
Right.
and making sure everyone has a good quality of life.
It's a balancing act.
And I think the success of this experiment will depend on a lot of things. The regulatory frameworks, the strength of civil society, and whether the government can find that sweet spot
Yeah.
between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
It's a tightrope walk, for sure.
So we've talked a lot about the potential upsides and downsides of Milei's plan,
Right.
but I think it's important to step back for a second and acknowledge just how big of a gamble this is for Argentina.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
I mean, Argentina has a history of failed economic experiments.
That's true, and this could really make or break the global libertarian movement, too.
Right. Like, if it works, it could be a huge victory for them.
Absolutely. It could embolden libertarian movements all over the world.
Yeah.
But if it fails, it'll be a cautionary tale.
Yeah, a cautionary tale against these radical free market reforms.
Exactly.
So it all comes down to this. Can a nation, especially one as complex as Argentina, really function without a state?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And it's one that anarcho-capitalists have been debating for a long time.
Mm.
They envision this world where private companies provide all the services that the government usually does.
Everything from law enforcement to national defense.
Yeah, but is that really feasible in the real world?
Well, even libertarians disagree on that.
Okay, so what are the sticking points?
Well, some people argue that private markets could handle everything efficiently, but others worry about market failures.
Especially in areas like law enforcement.
Right, because the profit motive,
Mm-hmm.
it might not be compatible with the need for impartiality and public safety.
Yeah, that's a big concern. Like, how do you make sure that private security forces aren't just acting in their own self-interest?
It's a tough one.
And what about private courts? How do you ensure that they're actually dispensing justice fairly?
Right, how do you prevent them from being swayed by wealth or power?
Exactly. So are there any solutions to those problems?
Anarcho-capitalists have some ideas.
What are they thinking?
Well, things like reputation systems.
Okay, so if a company gets a bad reputation...
People won't do business with them.
Interesting.
They also talk about having competing providers
Okay.
so that there's always an alternative if you're not happy with one company's service. And they emphasize contractual agreements.
With very clear standards and consequences.
Exactly. So it's all about creating these checks and balances.
Even without a traditional government.
Right.
But, I mean, has any of this actually been proven to work?
That's the problem. It's mostly theoretical at this point.
There's not a lot of real-world data to back it up.
No, not really.
And then you have the whole issue of public goods.
Things like infrastructure and environmental protection.
Yeah, those are tough because they're often hard for private markets to provide
Exactly.
because of things like free riding.
Where people benefit from the service without paying for it.
Right, and it's hard to exclude people who don't pay.
It is.
So how do anarcho-capitalists propose to deal with that?
Well, they talk about voluntary contributions,
Okay.
user fees,
Hmm.
and private agreements to fund and maintain these public goods.
But it's not clear if that would actually be enough to solve the problem.
No, especially on a large scale.
So I think it's safe to say that Miley's experiment is a really risky one.
Yeah, there are a lot of potential pitfalls.
And the world is definitely watching to see what happens.
They are.
Because the outcome could have major implications for the future of libertarian thought and policy debates around the world.
It could reshape our whole understanding of the role of government and the possibilities for societal organization.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has, but I think the most important thing to remember as we move forward is that we need to approach this situation with a critical eye.
Right. We can't get caught up in blind optimism or knee-jerk skepticism.
Exactly. We need to consider all sides of the issue.
Analyze the data carefully.
And be willing to change our minds as new information comes to light.
Because this is an ongoing experiment.
It is, and the results are far from certain.
But one thing's for sure, it's a pivotal moment in history.
It is, and we're all part of this unfolding story.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
That's what the deep dive is all about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.